You ready? All right. Good to see you. Glad you're here tonight. Let's get started. All of you joining in online, thanks for being here. Thanks for being there. Everybody here, thanks for being here. And we're back in Ten Commandments tonight. Talk about God's law and what we do with it. And so before we get started, I think the announcements I have are Sunday. Hope you'll plan on being here. Normal schedule on Sunday, 9:30 for ABFs and Sunday school, 10:30 for church. We'll be in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And so if you get a chance, read verses 1 through 9, give a little thought to it, and we'll talk about it on Sunday morning, all right? I think that is, don't forget the anniversary offering, and we are doing well with that, getting ready to wind that down. So if you haven't had a chance yet to participate in that, please remember that, all right? I think that's all the announcements I have, and so we're going to pray, and we'll jump right back in, all right? Father, give us a good time together tonight as we return to your word. Use it to teach us about your character, about your plan for us, about how that looked in Old Testament Israel and how it looks for us. Give us a good time together in your word. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, we are in Exodus 20, and which is the part of Scripture. Israel has just come out of the Promised Land. Israel just come out of Egypt, headed into the Promised Land. All right, they are in that period of time that gets about 40 years is what it turns out to be. I remember they leave Egypt. God delivers them. God gives them all the spoil, the plunder of the Egyptians. They get trapped. God delivers them at the Red Sea, or the Yom Suf, the Sea of Reeds we talked about last week. God delivers them. God leads them through a couple incidents of complaining. All right, and then at the foot of Mount Sinai, God gives them what becomes sort of the constitution of Israel, if you will, use kind of a modern terminology. We call it the Ten Commandments. All right, so remember in Exodus 19, God says, if you'll keep all my words and my laws, I'll be your God, you'll be to me a people, a kingdom of priests. All right, that's the political foundation of Israel as a political entity. And don't think of politics like we do in modern America, like left and right and all these things. It's just a political state. All right. Remember, previously in Genesis 12, they become an ethnic or genetic ethnic identity as the sense of Abraham. In Exodus 19, they become a political entity, a kingdom of priests. And so in Exodus 19, God established this. Exodus 20 then starts what we call the Ten Commandments. And so Exodus 19 is the preparation for the covenant. Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapters 21 to 24 are various laws. All right, so this is kind of a section right there in the middle of Exodus. Remember, in Exodus chapter 25 then starts the building of the tabernacle. But we're focused on these laws right now. Now, about the Ten Commandments, a couple things, and I think I mentioned some of this last week, but just for the sake of review, the Ten Commandments appear twice in the Bible, right? Once here in Exodus chapter 20, the others in Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Scripture, they're called words, the 10 words. And you often hear people refer to them that way, the Decalogue. Deca, 10, logos, words, the Decalogue, 10 words. They are, in a sense, as I described it, kind of a constitution of sorts. The Decalogue is not designed to be a law that addresses every single variation or technicality. All right, the law creates categories of things. And we'll talk some more about that tonight. For instance, last week we talked about the command to honor parents, right? And we specify, I don't think that command is a category of just honoring the two people who gave you life, your mom and dad, right? It's a command about honoring authority, about your grandparents and great-grandparents. So it's really a command about family structure and societal structure. The honor that is due, as some of you remember the King James Version, the hoary head. All right, the gray hair. Hoary sounds so much more dignified, perhaps, than gray. I don't know. But there is this idea that there is a societal structure of honor that is due to a society, that a society is built on. All right, so it really creates kind of, and you might imagine it this way, an umbrella. All right, it creates an umbrella, and underneath that umbrella are all kinds of things related to it. It is not a, it's not a specific outline of every individual law with technicalities. All right. The last thing I want to just remind us is divided in two sections, right? The 10 words for God and man. So the first 4 are about God and man. Worship no other gods, make no images or idols, don't misuse God's name, and remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. All right? The second 6 commandments, or what's sometimes called the second table of the law, are 10 words for man and man. And I did not change that up there. It should say 10 words for man to man. The Bible is inspired. My PowerPoint is not. It may have errors in it. In this case, it certainly does, right? It should be 10 words for man to man. So this is about how Israelites were to relate to each other. All right, so the first one, honor your father and mother. That's the sanctity of family. All right, the sanctity of family. The second one, we were talking about last week, do not murder. And this is the sanctity of life. Now, let me just kind of tie up a few thoughts from last week. Remember, the idea, thou shalt not kill, is a little bit misleading, right? Because it's not just killing that is prohibited. It's murder. It's a specific kind of killing that is prohibited. So this does not apply, for instance, a war. All right, war is not murder. It could be, but for the most part, it's not. And we could get into all the just war theory and what does that look like. All right, but we don't want to go there tonight. But what I wanted to say, this is talking about a very specific thing about the sanctity of human life. We talked last week about abortion. Right? We talk about murder. That's the obvious one. There were categories in the law for things like premeditated murder versus accidental murder, right? Or accidental killing. There were categories for like what we would call today manslaughter. As somebody dies, but it wasn't with the intent to kill them. It was kind of a byproduct of another act. All right, so in our laws today, we have all kinds of different categories that are based on the same kind of categories that the Scripture uses in various places to describe killing. We talked about the sanctity of life on the back end, euthanasia. All right, what do we do with people who have reached the end of life? Is there a place to take active steps to end a life, such as somebody who's terminally ill, as opposed to not taking active steps and letting sickness or age or whatever run its natural course? I think what the sanctity of life under thou shalt not murder, the sanctity of life means we don't have to take extraordinary steps. We could get to a place where the doctors say, you know what, there's no more hope. We can't really do it. We can keep them alive almost indefinitely, but we can't really have any hope they're going to get better. And so there comes a place where we might say something along the lines of just keep them comfortable. And at that point, usually hospice comes in, right? Just end-of-life care. We're not taking extraordinary steps to preserve it. We're going to let it run its natural course, and eventually we know it's going to die. That's going to be the result. The person's going to die. All right? That's different than somebody who's terminally ill, and the doctor says, you know what, you got 2 years to live, and the person says, you know what, let's just end it now. Give me a little shot of something. All right, those are two different things. All right, the command to not kill applies to one of them, not to the other. All right, because it's about active steps of premeditation to take a human life. We talk about abortion. Abortion, is the taking of human life. Right? I think this is one area where science is catching up to theology. All right, science is more and more we can demonstrate life. And as others have pointed out, abortion, and again, this is big at our church here, the Downriver Pregnancy Resource Center. We've put a lot of effort and continue to put a lot of effort into it. All right, abortion is the taking of a human life. All right, and so people say, well, it's okay because it's really small and it's in a certain location. I'm like, well, that's not really a good argument, right? I think I mentioned this last week. Many people talk about, when you start talking about abortion, you can really make people feel bad. And I understand the emotional component of that. And what I want to point out is that abortion really does make one person feel bad. And then he doesn't feel anything at all. Why? Because you've taken a life. Now, I know there's a lot of emotional impact. And the kind of comments, the kind of things I'm doing here in a public setting is not the way I would handle it in a private setting. It's not the way our pregnancy center counselors would handle it in terms of being, because we want to be filled with grace and kindness and mercy towards people who are in difficult situations. But at the same time, we want to tell the truth. Sometimes people say, you really shouldn't, so-called pile on a woman about abortion because she's already had a difficult enough time. And that, to me, raises the question, why has she had a difficult time? And the answer is because she knows. She knows what it is. You don't have a difficult time. You don't really wrestle with, hey, I got this cancer tumor in my body. You don't really have a difficult emotional time with wrestling with the doctor. I'm not sure I want to take it out. I do, I don't. Right? Because we know. We instinctively know. And then science comes along and confirms what we know. One of the interesting passages, actually, if you're in your Bibles, Exodus chapter 21, this is one that often gets used in support of abortion. And I think it's totally, to me, this is a pretty obvious one. Look at chapter 21, verse 22. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she, and this New American Standard I'm reading from translates, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband made a man of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. Okay, now, some of you might have a translation. In fact, let me just ask, how many of you have a translation that says something different than gives birth prematurely? All right. What do you got? So the children come out? Miscarriage? Okay. That is one of the things. Hold on to that thought. I think the King James Version, so there's seed depart from her, or fruit depart from her. Okay. Something along those lines, Darren, is that right? Yep. I don't remember all the various translations. I should have actually marked them out. I looked at them again, and then I didn't actually put them in my notes. Here's kind of the controversy, because people say, well, see, you get a fight, and the seed, the baby is miscarried, and that goes to what Dave was saying. The baby is miscarried. See, it's just a fine. And wait a second. Read the next verse. If there is any further injury, then you shall appoint the penalty, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. What is that? That's what we call, any Latin fans in here? That's the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, an equal penalty. So what happens if she gives birth prematurely? The answer is just a fine, right? You got in a fight, and she gave birth prematurely. There was no further injury. What happens if the baby dies? Then it's life for life, right? Because that's the point of the verse. It's setting up this structure, right? So, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this abortion, but just remind us, this is not really, it shouldn't be all that controversial, right? Science, just our humanity. Again, I go back to the emotional aspect of people know. All right, but let's delve just a few minutes more into this idea about the sanctity of human life, because here's what is often accused of people who are pro-life: is there are certain segments. Let's divide into pro-life and what's typically called pro-choice or pro-abortion. I don't care which word you use for it. That's not my point. My point is there are some who are pro-life, and we think that abortion is evil. We think abortion is murder. It should be stopped. By the way, here's an interesting story. There was a number of years ago, probably 3 or 4 or 5 years ago now, in the Detroit Free Press, there was an article about a young lady who I think was 7 or 8 months pregnant, gave birth in the garage, and left the baby to die, and they charged her with homicide. And here's the irony. Had she been at a doctor's office, it would have been entirely fine. And that's how messed up this is. Okay, now, we often talk about pro-choice and pro-life, okay? And here's the pro-choice people, the pro-abortion, and I do want to say there are a lot of people who I think they're totally wrong. But I want to be careful that when we talk about pro-abortion, it's not people who out there who are active. Not everybody in the pro-abortion category is actively promoting abortion, okay? There's a good number of people who I think they're wrong, but they're quite adamant, we don't want to see abortion. We want to do everything we can to prevent abortion, but we don't think the government should outlaw it. Okay, I think that is a philosophically indefensible position. But I want to make sure that we're clear that not everybody is in the same category. But here's a charge that pro-choice people often make against pro-life people. You're not really pro-life, you're pro-birth. And you don't really care what happens to the baby after it's born. Okay, now, I think they're wrong. Because what comes into that is not that pro-life people don't care about what happens to the baby after the baby's born. What the issue is that we have a disagreement about how we should take care of people at various stages of life. All right, so that's typically come into, you pro-life people, you want to make sure all the babies are born, but you want to take away welfare so the babies have nothing to eat. You want to make sure that babies are born, but you don't care about everybody having health care because you're not really pro-life, you're just pro-birth. And here's what I want to challenge you. I think the sanctity of human life does have some implications for how we care for life that's perfectly healthy, right? So pro-life is not just let's make sure they get born and then ignore everything else. I mean, there is a sense in which we as a society have, I think, some level of obligation to provide for life of those who are living. I think it has some implications for what we might call social programs of welfare. Again, I know we got probably a variety of opinions in here on what exactly that should look like. And I think it's entirely appropriate and entirely acceptable for us to have different opinions on what that should look like politically or as a society. I think when it comes to healthcare issues, a healthcare issue is an issue of the sanctity of life. Now, again, we can differ on exactly what that should look like. But let's not pretend like, that's just a political debate. Let's realize that when we talk about the sanctity of human life, it's not just let's make sure they get born and let's make sure we don't kill them on the way out. There are some things in the middle that also have to do with the sanctity of human life. It really stakes out the claim of God over all of life. Think about Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. This is in that passage where Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." How many of you think in that passage, I don't know, this may be a little bit of a trick question nobody wants to answer. How many in that passage think Jesus was changing the law? All right? You've heard it said, "You shall not commit murder. Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. Whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go to a fiery hell." All right, how many of you think Jesus was adding to the law? I don't think he was. I think Jesus was explaining the law had a bunch of stuff in it, and you guys have become so legalistic, you don't get it. I mean, think about it this way. One of these is, you've heard it said, and we'll get this as actually the next one. You've heard it say, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, everyone who looks on a woman with lust has already committed adultery. Do you think prior to Jesus' words in Matthew 5:28 that it would have been acceptable to lust after a woman? No, that's built in the command. Jesus was pointing out, you've become so legalistic, you've forgotten what this is actually about. You want to define it so narrowly that you find this is an umbrella about the various things. So, Jesus, in dealing with some of these commandments, Jesus actually explains there's more here than simply don't murder somebody. There's more here about the sanctity of life. And again, we can differ on exactly what that looks like. But all of life is in the image of God, and all of life is to be honored from the proverbial womb to the tomb, if you're into rhymes. All right? Let's move on. Thou shalt not commit adultery. This is about the sanctity of marriage. Right? Easy one. In some respects, goes back to God's creation design of one man, one woman for life. Heterosexual committed marriage. Okay? What is adultery? Adultery is any sort of sexual or intimate involvement outside of that heterosexual, committed, monogamous, lifelong marriage. Okay, now what was God's plan for marriage? All right, all the way back to Genesis, a man and a woman for life. One man, one woman, one lifetime. Okay? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. They go and start a new family. Now, here's what we know. And again, Jesus said, listen, Moses permitted you because of the hardness of your hearts to put away your wives. But from the beginning, it wasn't so. So we know that divorce is real. We know that divorce actually ends a marriage. There are some who, and I know this can be controversial for some, okay, so hear me out on this. There are some who say, well, yeah, you can get divorced legally, but you're still married in the eyes of God. I think the Scripture is pretty clear that divorce actually ends a marriage. Moses permitted you from the beginning. Moses permitted you because of the hardness of your hearts, but from the beginning it was not so. All right, if you're still married in the eyes of God, then what did Moses permit you to do? Right? I mean, he permitted you to divorce. Okay? So, God's plan for marriage is one man, one woman for a lifetime. Adultery is any sexual intimate involvement outside of that. It's not just the act of a married person having intimacy with another married person to whom they are not married. All right, sometimes it's out. So in our minds, we create these categories of adultery is what married people do. Fornication is what single people do with each other. Lust is what single people do with themselves. And so we divide all these kind of categories. And what I want to point out is the command, thou shalt not commit adultery, is all of that. Moses was not intending to say, hey, certain things are okay. This is not. Now, again, this is later on expounded on in later parts of the law. This umbrella of adultery and the sanctity of marriage is expounded on later with how adulterous relationships are handled, how relationships between engaged couples are handled, how relationships between unmarried man and woman in a field versus an unmarried man and woman in a city. All right, it's different, but they're all included under this umbrella of the sanctity of marriage. So it refers to the whole category of sexual sin, and that's why Jesus can say, you can commit adultery by yourself. If a man looks on a woman to lust after her, she doesn't even have to be involved in it. Okay? Why is this such a big deal? Well, on the one hand, it takes what rightfully belongs to one person and gives it to somebody else. And again, emotionally, in a marriage, we understand this, right? I mean, we can kind of get a sense of that sense of belonging, that sense of commitment and covenant that two people have made together. And if you've ever been the so-called victim of it, the so-called innocent party, you know the kind of stab to the heart. It just feels like you've been ripped apart. Why? Because you've taken what rightly belongs to one person and given it to somebody else. And for that reason, in the New Testament, Jesus permits divorce. He doesn't command divorce. He doesn't say you have to. And I encourage couples in those situations. I've counseled over the years with many of them, and encourage couples. Listen, there's forgiveness, there's grace. Yes, it's hard, and you might have an out. You might be able to divorce, but I'm asking you right now, stay in it. Let's see what we can do. So there is this sense of which it just rips apart, and people say, well, if you divorce, you've broken the covenant. And I would say the person who committed adultery is the one who broke the covenant. You're the one who broke it apart. Okay? It prohibits premarital sex before marriage. Right? Again, that's in the law, as it talks about unmarried people and what should be done. It prohibits extramarital sex. I think it prohibits even intimate relationships of emotions, what we might today call an emotional affair. You've taken what belongs to one person and you've given it to somebody else. You've violated your marriage commitment to be one flesh, one in purpose, one in life with one person. You've taken that and you've given it to somebody else. Even in emotions, it can be a violation of the sanctity of marriage. This is because the bond between a husband and wife is to be permanent, as long as you both shall live. And that's written right in the marriage vows, right? And I still, when I perform weddings, sometimes couples write their own vows, and I also use kind of traditional ones. Do you take this person to be your lawfully wedded husband or wife to have and to hold from this day forward? And sickness, health, rich or poor, yada, yada, da-da-da. I'm going from memory now. Till death do you part, right? And oftentimes in marriage counseling, I remind couples, you're having a hard time. You made a promise. for better or worse, and this is the worst. And it's time to keep your promise. You don't get to bail out just because it's worse. That you made that promise. And I remind people that in premarital counseling that when you stand before everybody else, this is what you're going to say, and you're making this promise before God and these assembled witnesses. And by the way, one of the things I think a lot of people, and again, I try to mention this when I do weddings, is that the people standing up beside you are not just witnesses to your wedding ceremony. They're going to be your companions throughout your marriage. And part of their job is going to be to help you. Probably not in the richer times. They may want to help you in the richer times, but the poorer times, they're going to help you. And not the better times, you're not going to need it, but in the worst times, they're going to help you say, hey, you made a promise, time to keep it. All right? Why? Because the marriage bond is intended to be permanent. And God uses this image to describe not just his relationship with Israel, and Israel's turned away. Remember, God, when Israel turns away to other gods, he calls it spiritual adultery. You've taken something that belonged to God, and you gave it to somebody else. He uses the same thing to talk about the relationship of Christ in the church in Ephesians chapter 5. So I think there's also an implication here about permanence. If marriage was not to be broken by a temporary fling of adultery, it's not to be broken by the permanency of divorce. Marriage is for life. Okay? Now, again, I understand that there are some difficult situations. I get it. Right? And I do believe that there are places where it is biblically acceptable to divorce. And I know not everybody agrees with me on that. I'm fine with that. Okay? If you come to me saying, hey, Pastor, such and such happened, will you please give me permission for divorce? The answer is probably going to be no. Not anytime soon. Because if you come to me, I do believe that there comes a time when a marriage is broken to a point to which it is irretrievable. Okay? However, you're going to have to talk to me an awful lot before I'm going to say, okay, I think you can. Okay? So, again, that can be a really touchy situation for people. And I know a lot of Christians disagree. There are some Christians who believe you can never divorce for any reason at all. Okay? There are some Christians who believe you can divorce for just about anything. We don't get along anymore. Right? I think there's a high value on the sanctity of marriage. That God intends you to be married to one person for life. It may be that your spouse dies. And in the providence of God, if that happens, that's what God has for you. And when that happens, I think it's part of what God has done. But what God has joined together, let not man separate. If God chooses to do it for his own reasons, we'll let God be God. But you don't get in the place of God. All right? Sanctity of marriage. Let's move on to number 8. Do not steal. What is this? The sanctity of private property. Sanctity of private property. Why is stealing wrong? The answer is because God has given you the right to own things. And when you own them, nobody else has the right to own the same things. They might own something identical to it, but not the thing you own. There is a right to private property. And while everything belongs to God, God has entrusted each of us with some of it. Right? He has not entrusted each of us with exactly the same thing. All right, so he may have entrusted you with a certain kind of car and entrusted somebody else with a different kind of car. And you may sit there and say, I really wish I had his car. You are entitled to buy that car from him if you can agree on a price for it. You are not entitled just to drive off with it, because he has a right to that piece of property. You're not entitled to something God hasn't given to you. Okay? It doesn't belong to you. You don't get just to walk out with it. Someone's possessions, think of it this way, some people's possessions are the expression of their life and work, their industry, and their diligence. Now again, God hasn't given everybody the same financial status in life. Even Jesus said, the poor you will always have among you. There are really rich people in the Bible, and there are really poor people, and God never sets out to fix that. Maybe because it's not broken. All right? Maybe it's just a part of God. God hasn't intended that all of us have exactly the same thing. All right? Some people, by reason of God's providence in their life may have what you would consider an extraordinary amount of money. You know what they get to do with that money? Whatever they want, right? And God may have given somebody else what you might consider an extraordinarily small amount of money. And you know what they get to do with that money? Whatever they want, right? But the person with extraordinary small amount of money doesn't have the right to go and take from the person with the extraordinary large amount of money. It doesn't belong to them. Now, going back just a moment to the sanctity of life, there is an avenue of thought and an implication here with private property and the sanctity of life that we talk about things like poverty. And how do we deal with poverty? Is the person in poverty entitled to steal? You know, there's actually a proverb about that, right? Don't make me so rich I become satisfied, and don't make me so poor that I have to steal to provide for my family. You know, it's interesting that society as a whole looks at this differently. All right, there are some who believe that billionaires shouldn't be billionaires, that they got there by theft. All right? And the answer is that most people who are billionaires got there because people willingly gave their money to them. Bill Gates was in the news this week. I don't know how many of you saw that. He was actually in the news for divorce. That's going to cost him a lot. $130 billion. I don't know exactly how that's going to get split up, but fair amount of money. All right. How did he get rich? He provided something people were willing to give him money for. He didn't steal it from anybody. All right. He provided something, and people willingly gave him money, or at least when they bought the computers that ran his software, it was part of it, and all. So those were all free transactions. This does not prohibit free transactions. And the fact that you choose to spend your money for certain things and a guy or a lady ends up creating something that a lot of people want and are willing to give money for, that's not theft. You willingly parted with your money. It does not prohibit taxation. Some people say, oh, taxes are theft. Not really. Did you know that Old Testament Israel had a system of taxation? It's called the tithe. And there were 2 tithes every year. And every third year, there was a third tithe, which meant, on average, Israelites paid somewhere about 23% of their money every year to fund various things. We would call it the government, the Levites, the religious system. The Levites, remember, they didn't have land. They didn't have farms. They weren't able to do that. They lived off the money that was given in the tithe. And it sounds really nice to call it a tithe, right? And we think of that like our church offering, like, hey, you can give it, you can not give it. Give it. Sorry. I didn't mean to say that out loud. Right? I mean, but that's how we look at something, right? The tithe, you know, yeah, I try to give, a little bit of money to the church. It was a tax. You had to give it. Right? And it was, by the way, it was more than 10%. People say, oh, Old Testament Israel, they tithe, so we should tithe in the church. I'm like, well, tithe like they did then, 23 1/3%. I'll let you do 20% 2 years and 30% the third year. But if you're going to use that, then do that. All right? But the point is, it's a tax, and that's how they support it. Taxation is not theft. Now, but it raises the interesting point, and this is a point about which people in good faith may differ. What is the right tax rate? At what point does taxation become forcing money from people that you have no right to? A lot smarter people than me have disagreed on that answer. I don't have a verse on that one, so I'm going to stay out of that. Except to say that, at one level, taxes are the price we pay to live in a society. Right? It's just part of it. All right, we want roads to drive on. You'd probably prefer not to have to drop a quarter in the box every time you turn on to Pennsylvania, and another quarter every time you turn on to Beach Daily, another quarter every time you turn on to Eureka, right? Let's just pay it all at one time to fund the things we need, right? Can you imagine if you had to pay the police every time you needed them? And you call, hey, 911, yeah, I got a guy breaking into my house. Like, I need $99.95. Can you give it to me now before they come? Because somebody's got to pay for that. All right, we pay for that up front. All right, that's what taxes are. Now, at some point, does a tax rate become some sort of theft of some sort? Probably. But what we need to understand is the Bible has this category of private property that does not exclude something like taxes. What does it prohibit? It prohibits you from taking things that don't belong to you. All right, it prohibits you from taking property, money. Probably prohibits you from taking even what we might call intangible things. Time. Stepping back for a moment to adultery. There's a case can be made that it prohibits you from stealing the affections of somebody. All right, so again, think of it as a broad category that you have a right to own certain things, and nobody has the right to take those from you. Number 9, do not bear false witness. This is the sanctity of truth. The sanctity of truth. Now, forbids perjury in the legal system. You cannot lie about someone to get them in trouble. You can't lie about them to ruin their reputation. You stand up and take an oath. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And these days, most courts use the phrase, do you swear or affirm? Do you know why that is, by the way? There's a position of some people who believe you should not swear. And the reason is, it's actually a pretty interesting reason that maybe you haven't thought of. The reason is that if I'm swear that I'm going to tell the truth, what does that imply about the times I speak that I don't swear? By the way, swearing, I don't mean your profanity, all right? I mean, I swear I'm going to tell the truth. Hand raised to God, I'm going to tell the truth. Well, yesterday you said something and you didn't have your hand raised. You didn't swear. Was that not true? See, that's their position is, I tell the truth all the time, so I'm not going to swear to tell the truth. So that's why the phrase, do you swear or affirm? They will affirm they're telling the truth because they always do, but they don't want to swear because they believe it would call into question the times that they don't swear. All right, no, so who is the neighbor here bearing false witness against your neighbor? Your neighbor's open-ended. It's anybody you have dealings with. All right, it's really anybody at all, people. And so the principle here is that you are to tell the truth. It extends to all honesty. We're to tell the truth to anyone who has a legitimate claim to it. Okay, and again, I use that phrase, legitimate claim, because there are some cases in which somebody might demand the truth who doesn't have a legitimate claim to it. So here's kind of the classic example of this. You're living in Germany in 1944, and you're harboring some Jews in your house, and the Nazis show up and say, do you have Jews living here? What do you do? Okay, somebody, well, you know what? You should tell the truth and leave it to God. Or you say, no, I know what you're going to do. I don't have any Jews living here. Okay, now, when it comes to truth, there are some really ethical quandaries that we can get into. It probably doesn't apply to you. All right, most of us, when we're tempted to kind of shade the truth a little bit, it's not because we're in an ethical quandary. It's because we're about to look really bad. All right, you looking bad is not a good reason to lie. There are some ethical quandaries. Listen to an interesting interview this week, a podcast I listened to, an interview with a guy named James Rosen, I believe his name is. He was spent his whole life. He's a devout Roman Catholic. Spent his whole life in the CIA and became the director of counterintelligence at the CIA. And there's a really interesting interview about the ethics of spying, espionage, those kinds of things. So it's now caused me to add a couple of books to my book reading list because I want to read more about what he has to say. All right, what is this command? Truth. Don't commit perjury. All right, so Leviticus 5:1, it even applies to withholding truth. Listen to Leviticus 5:1. Now, if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration testify when he's a witness, whether he has seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, he will bear his guilt. So here's a situation where you've been called to testify, you know the truth, and you refuse to tell it. You're guilty. You're guilty. Civil society depends on being able to trust the words of others. You have kind of expectation when you go to buy something that the person you're buying it from, like that used car dealer, is going to tell you the truth about it. Used car dealers get pretty bad raps, right? They probably earned it in some cases. But you have this expectation that, hey, I'm trusting you because you're going to tell me things that I have no way of knowing. I've got to trust your word. When you stand up in a court of law, it depends on people telling the truth. And the whole society really hangs on that. That when you can't trust somebody, it's going to create significant problems. Deuteronomy 19. The judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is a false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he had intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. Think about that in the court of law. If witnesses on the witness stand know, hey, if I don't tell the truth, I'm going to get what he would have gotten. So you put that in the context of here you're accusing a guy of theft and he's facing 20 years in the prison. Right, hey, if I lie about that, I'm going to get the 20 years. You think you're going to think twice before you talk? Right, you probably will. Right? Why? Because there is a high priority that God places on truth and a society being able to trust each other. There are things today in our civil society that are called privilege. So attorney-client privilege. You're familiar with that? Hopefully not by experience. All right, but maybe by experience where you have an attorney whose job it is to represent you in court, and that attorney is bound. He cannot reveal anything that you've told him in the context of that attorney-client relationship. So you're being tried for murder, and you tell your attorney, yeah, I murdered the guy. He cannot legally reveal that, right? He's bound. And even throughout his whole life, even after his relationship with you is over, he can't reveal that. There's also something called marital privilege, that a husband and wife can't be compelled to testify against each other. Okay, now there's some limits on that. There's what's called a clergy privilege, that if you come to me and confess to a crime, and you come to me because I'm the pastor, you say, hey, pastor, you're my pastor, I committed this crime. I cannot reveal that in court. I'm forbidden by law. Now, a lot of people are troubled by that. Okay? But that's the way law is. And the reason is that's historically been the case to protect the right of a person to get spiritual counsel and direction without fear of being ratted out, so to speak. Again, our practical law system, our legal system has created certain categories for, I think, for the most part, for good reasons. Okay? Now, again, far brighter legal minds than mine, which would be basically any legal mind at this point. Legal stuff is not my expertise. But these are issues that have been long thought about long and hard. But here's what we need to understand at the foundation of the ninth commandment is tell the truth. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. I mean, if you're going to say something, mean it. All right, now, if you're planning a surprise birthday party, no, you're not required to reveal that. All right? You don't have to. If you've been invited to a surprise birthday party, and someone says, hey, where are you going Saturday? Hey, I'm going to your surprise birthday party. Just act like you're surprised. Why? Because I wasn't allowed to lie. All right? That's not what this is about. All right? Is people have a legitimate claim to the truth. All right, so I think that's the ninth commandment. Let's go to the 10th commandment, do not covet. What is different about this one? How in the world do you enforce this? Police pull up behind you. Hey, I saw you sitting beside that Porsche at the stoplight. I think you were coveting that. I'm writing you a ticket for it. Right? It doesn't even make any sense, does it? This is because in this law, God is going to what I would call the sanctity of the human heart. That there's some things that are wrong that can't necessarily be measured and outwardly demonstrated. And this is where the Old Testament departs from most other laws. Can you imagine if our society today in 21st century America had a law against coveting? I mean, it just is. But God's law, as the moral ruler, the creator of the universe, the moral ruler of his people, was able to have this law. Covetousness is to be ruled by the desire to possess and to direct one's life toward that desire, to make it the ultimate end. You have this desire for something that's so overwhelming, your whole life is given towards getting it. I call it greed, covetousness, envy. And this can take place in a number of different ways, right? Here's the verse, don't covet your neighbor's house. I wish he had started with something else, because I've seen some pretty nice houses, right? Come on, start with don't covet your neighbor's wife, male servant, female servant, ox, donkey, anything that belongs to your neighbors. As far as I know, my neighbors have no oxes or donkeys, so I'm good on that one. But what was he talking about here? Again, here's our tendency. Our tendency is to say, well, houses, I'm satisfied. Neighbor's wife, no, I know her. Not a chance in the world I want her. Servants, right? Oxes, donkeys, I'm good. All right, but what we don't understand is that God is addressing a bigger category of the human heart. Are you satisfied with the life God has given to you? Or are you coveting the life he's given to somebody else? And coveting is not, man, that's a really nice car. I hope one day I might be able to get something like that. Like you want to upgrade from the 1988, rusted out beater. I'm hoping to get something in the 90s pretty soon. Right? I mean, something like that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about, hey, that's a really nice house you have. That's a really nice whatever. He's talking about the kind of covetousness that takes over the heart and begins to drive everything we do. That so we no longer are worshiping God alone. We're now worshiping the thing that we just can't bear to live without. And our whole life becomes driven by this, I got to have that, and if I don't get that, I will never be happy. God is no longer enough for us. We're not satisfied with what God has given to us. And so the danger here is that we can become driven by covetousness that technically doesn't violate any laws of the land, but reveals that we're not actually serving God and worshiping God alone. Here's a quote from somebody, Stewart's his name. What people wish for has a major role in what kind of society they will create. People able to curtail their wishing so that it's limited to things they should desire are people who contribute good to society. Those who want what they cannot properly have undermine a society's moral fiber. All right, let me try it again, okay? What people wish for has a major role in what kind of society they will create. People who are able to curtail their wishing so that it's limited to things they should desire are people who contribute good to society. Those who want what they cannot properly have undermine a society's moral fiber. Why? Why do they undermine it? Because they're constantly using the system to try to get what they want. And it undermines the moral fiber of the connections that we have. So God here is commanding, guard your heart. Guard your heart. Guard what you want. Be satisfied with me. Now, satisfaction doesn't mean you never desire promotion at work. Satisfaction satisfaction in God doesn't mean that you never take another job that might have higher pay or a better standard of living or better hours or whatever, right? Satisfaction means if God gives me opportunities, I'm going to weigh those carefully. And I'm going to make sure my heart is satisfied in what God has given to me. And if God gives me more, I'm going to make sure my heart is satisfied with more. And if God takes it away, I'm going to make sure my heart's satisfied with less. Okay, so covetousness, again, is a big category, but it's a category about the sanctity of the human heart. So these commandments, they didn't just show up here. They're in Genesis, right? Ham dishonored his father Noah and got a curse for it. Cain was a murderer. Adultery, we see all over, particularly Sodom and Gomorrah. Rachel was a thief. She stole their father's idols. Abraham was a liar. Remember Lot's wife. That's the actual verse. I was just say I got a verse on that one. That is the verse, right? She turned around and looked back. Why? Because she couldn't bear to leave the things behind. What is God doing with these laws? Well, God was giving his people a worldview, a way to view life. All right, again, these are not just legal stipulations. I mean, if you ever read laws in our society, it's like billions of pages long, it seems like, and all kinds of subsections and subsections and technicalities and this, that, and the other. And what you're paying lawyers for are to find the technicalities that get you off the hook. There are no technicalities. God's given us a worldview. This is not just about can you cross all the T's and dot all the I's. This is not just about making sure you stay between the dotted lines on the road and stopping at the stop signs. Don't even roll through it a little bit. Make sure you get the complete stop behind the line, right? That's not what this is about. God's given his people a worldview. About who God is, about how we respond to God, about who our fellow man is and how we live with fellow man in society. God's given us a worldview. They're not intended to address every single circumstance of life. They're teaching how do we honor the life God's given us to live? How do we honor the God who's given us this life? How do we live in this world? God was teaching people a way of life in the community. All right, and this is really connected to how they were to live together. Many of the laws in Israel were laws that dealt with God. We would call them kind vertical laws, right? But many laws were horizontal. And so if you have a ditch and your neighbor's donkey falls into it, there are certain things that happen. Like, man, what's spiritual about a ditch? Nothing. But God's law addresses it, right? So God was giving his people a way to live together. And so in all of fallen life, if we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't need laws because we would all treat each other with perfect dignity and respect. But because we're sinners, we need laws to govern that and laws to tell us what to do when things go off the rails. God was also showing people that living was a part of worship. Your relationship with God is not disconnected from your relationship with others. In other words, you can't come into worship and say, hey, I'm worshiping God alone while I'm coveting my neighbor's car. They're all connected. It's part of the same 10 words, right? Hey, we're not going to have any graven images, but I'm going to have that thing in my mind that I just keep fantasizing about. Yeah, you know, I'm gonna remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, but I'm gonna work like double overtime for the whole rest of the week and ignore my family. You can't separate those things. All of life is one package, and the way we worship God and the way that we live together matters. Now, what do we do with the law today? All right, I believe that God's law was given to God's people, and that there's a lot of things in the Old Testament law that make no sense to us. How many of you, and this is kind of one of those easy examples, how many of you look at your clothes and your clothes are made of mixed fibers, right? I mean, you got some with a little polyester in there and a little cotton and a little wool and all these mixtures, right? And the Bible has this command, don't mix your fabrics. Like, how many of you are sinning, breaking the law of God right now? I don't know, let me check. Can you look at my tag and see if I got the right clothes on? Right? I don't think that the law of God that God gave to Israel is for us today. Now, here's why I say that. God talks about the fact in Galatians chapter 3 that the law was a schoolmaster to lead us to faith. Now, here's how a lot of people understand that this is the difference between unbelievers and believers. That the law was given so that you would know you're a sinner and bring you to faith in Christ. I think that's true in some respects. I don't think that's the point of Galatians 3. I think the point of Galatians 3 is that the law was a schoolmaster to lead us to the time of faith. the time of faith in Christ. Christ hadn't come yet. The law was given to govern life in Old Testament Israel. All right? And that was going to lead them up until the time Christ came, and then there was going to be the church, and then the political nation states would take a different shape at that point. All right? So there are some people today who want to enforce Israel's law on society. I think it's a really bad idea for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is we don't need clothes police running around checking out, the mix of fibers in our clothes. And everybody here says, well, duh, of course we don't need that. But you can't separate the law. See, here's what people want to do. You have these laws about worshiping God. You have these laws about theft and murder. You have these laws about the kind of crops you can plant and how often you can plant your field. And you have laws about how you can harvest your crops. And you have laws about making sure that your roof has fences on it and making sure you have all these different kind of laws. And the fact is they all exist as one law. You can't pick and choose. Well, I like this one. We'll obey this one, but the rest of them. And by the way, all laws have punishments. So if you have any of the law, you have to have all of the law. I got a verse on that one, right? Remember James. If a man offends in one point, he has broken all. The whole law, the law exists as a whole. In Galatians chapter 5, Paul says if you keep part of it, you have to keep all of it. You can't just pick and choose. And the issue in Galatians was circumcision. And Paul said, no, that's part of the law. If you do that, you got to keep it all. By the way, the law also has penalties and benefits. Be like, well, the law says if you keep all God's laws, He'll bless you. He also said if you break the laws, He'll curse you. How many of you want that? Right? You can't do that. So there's a group of people out there, sometimes they're called theonomists. All right, the law of God, sometimes they're called reconstructionists. They want to kind of reconstruct society after a biblical pattern. I think it's a really bad idea. All right, I've read enough newspapers to know kind of who our politicians are. And frankly, I don't really trust them to be able to fairly write, the laws and be able to fairly administer them. A theocracy, the rulership of God works when God is the theocrat. And there'll come a day when we have a perfect leader, a perfect king. His name is Jesus. And until then, we're going to have imperfect rulers, an imperfect application of the laws. But the law of Israel was given for an agricultural nomadic society in the first and second millennia before Christ. It doesn't really work well for us today, and God never intended it to. So what about the Ten Commandments in courthouses? I don't really care. I know it's staggering to some people, right? Like, oh, they're taking the Ten Commandments out. I'm like, they're not following them anyway. It's wall decoration. And yeah, I believe we should worship God only. I'm not a big fan of the government mandating that. Because as a Christian, I believe in freedom of conscience. You know what? If you don't want to worship God only, you should be free to not worship God only. If you want to worship some other God, you know what? I think you should be free to do that. Not because I think it's okay, but because I think the impetus of the Christian faith is one of an individual's relationship with God that joins into a community of like-minded people, and you can't coerce the conscience. Yeah, I can make you show up. Well, I can't actually, but in times past, in even American history, there were laws that you had to attend church on Sunday. They could make you show up and fine you if you didn't. But they can't make you have a soft heart towards God. And they can't make you sing songs with any meaning behind it. They really can't even keep you awake during the preaching. Right? I've given up on that. So, God's law was given to govern that society at that time. We're no longer bound by that law. So what do we make of the Ten Commandments? Remember, the Ten Commandments are umbrellas, right? The Ten Commandments are kind of categories of things. And where did that law come from? The law of Israel was the expression of God's character and God's will for a particular people at a particular time. So behind these laws is a God. And what we need to do is let's look at this law. Let's figure out, what does this law tell us about God? And then figure out, what do we know about God? What does that look like now? Okay? So, when we talk about the Ten Commandments, I'm fine with them not being in courthouses. All right? But as I pointed out last week, as long as there are laws against theft, at least one of the Ten Commandments is going to be in the courthouses. Okay? Just there. All right? There are actually laws in our land about honoring authorities, right? You're not entitled to go into a courtroom and talk to a judge any way you want to. And I think that stems from honor your father and mother, that there is a societal structure of honor that is due to elders and positions of respect. And the judge believes that too, because he'll fine you for contempt of court and maybe even put you in jail. Right? So the categories are there. The law raised an impossibly high standard. I'm going to close with this. Okay? The law raised an impossibly high standard, not just a difficult standard. An impossibly high standard. The law can make no one perfect. Hebrews chapter 10. The law can make no one perfect. In fact, Romans chapter 7, Paul says, it's by the law that I came to know how bad my sin was. When there was no law, I didn't realize I was breaking it. And then all of a sudden somebody said, hey, you can't do that. Like, oh, I've been doing that all along, which means I've been sinning. I just didn't know it. Now all of a sudden sin becomes so much more sinful because now I know what I'm supposed to do and I'm not doing it. The law had this impossibly high standard. It can't make you perfect. The law can't justify sinners. Romans chapter 3. By the works of the law, no flesh, no person shall be justified. It just can't do it. The law cannot make you better. All the law can do is show how bad you are, and we got a pretty good handle on that sometimes. The law can't make you righteous. The law can't give you life. Galatians chapter 3, if righteousness could come by the law, then Jesus died uselessly. You just can't do it. But I'm going to close with Romans chapter 8. What the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did. Sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh but according to the Spirit. What the law could not do, God did. Now, there's this aspect in which the law governs life this way. Right? And so when you're driving down Pennsylvania, there's a law that says you drive on the right. And you're hoping the people coming the other way, drive on the right. They're right? There's kind of this societal compact. And there's no barriers there. If somebody decides not to drive on the right, guess what? You're in trouble. So we have this kind of thing we agree on, and we trust other people live by the laws of the land. But there is a God behind it. There's a God over it. And that is ultimately our king and our ruler. And the law could never make us right with God. Because at some point in your life, you've crossed the law. You've crossed the proverbial yellow line somewhere. And once you've done that, you're done. You'll never be perfect. You weren't to begin with, but just in case you thought, you weren't. And here's the good news. What the law could not do, God did. Sending his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. Trust in that. Yes, the law was a schoolmaster to get us to the time of Christ, this Old Testament Israel. The God behind the law, the God over the law, the God from whom that law comes, that moral lawgiver, is the one who says, that law is just an illustration of how bad it really is. But here's my Son sent to do what you can never do for yourself. Take hope in that. Let's pray. Father, as we read your law, it can be overwhelming to us, and we see it's given for the good of us, and we strive to keep these principles. But in the midst of that, we realize that what the law could not do, you did for us, and that's our hope. We want to live holy lives before you. We want to pursue you. But in the midst of all of it, we understand that you are the one who pursued us, and so we take hope in that. Use your word to change us. May we live in righteousness and holiness before you. May we live in righteousness with others. May you build us into the kind of people you desire us to be. In the name of Christ I pray. Amen. Hey, thanks for being here tonight. Good to see you. Have a great night, great week. See you Sunday, 9:30.